everyone. Welcome back to your Cosmic Matrix podcast with your host, myself, Laura Matsu, and my husband, Bernhard Gunther. And on this episode, we are going to be discussing the August eclipse season and what these eclipses could mean, both collectively and for you personally. So in part one, we're going to start by talking about eclipses in general, why they have historically been associated with periods of accelerated change, major beginnings and endings, unexpected events, revelations. Also, people or circumstances can suddenly become eclipsed in or out of our lives. And then we're going to break down the astrology of this August 12th total solar eclipse in Leo and the August 27th, 28th lunar eclipse in Pisces and the larger eclipse cycles they're a part of, the aspects that surround them and the themes that they may bring up, and give you some reflections for working with each one. And we're also going to look at why August is such an interesting threshold, because simultaneously we're beginning a new Leo and Aquarius eclipse story while approaching the end of the Virgo Pisces eclipse story that began back in 2024. Because the nodes of the moon have actually changed signs, and now they are in the Leo Aquarius axis. And then in part two, which is again exclusively for members. So if you're not a member yet, you can go to veilofreality.com/membership and get access to all the second hours of all of our podcasts. We're going to go even deeper and talk about the do's and don'ts of eclipse season, the different ways that different cultures have worked with eclipses. We're also going to talk about the Saros cycle and these kind of like series of eclipses that occur across time, and the fascinating connection that both these eclipses have to 2008. I'm also going to share some case studies, including my own personal eclipse season stories. We're also going to look at a couple people we notice are going to be deeply affected by the eclipse: Vladimir Putin and Stephen Forrest. So that's quite an interesting combo. I didn't look like too deep. I did check Trump's chart as well. It's not going to be hitting him exact. So we're just going to use him as case studies,
By the
right?
way, for people who don't know, Stephen Forrest is a very established, popular astrologer.
Evolutionary astrologer, actually.
Yeah.
So these two people are both experiencing significant eclipse activations right now. And then finally, at the end of part two, I'm going to go through all 12 rising signs so you can see exactly where these eclipses are landing in your own chart, what area of life may be going through a season of release or ending, and where something new may be trying to come in. So there's a lot to get into. So let's just start with talking about what eclipses actually are and the general themes of them. So you'll hear a lot of astrologers say that eclipses are basically full moons on steroids. So they carry that same charge, that intense quality of a full moon, except the volume is going to be cranked way up. So they tend to carry this kind of unpredictable quality, almost Uranian aspect to them that regular full moons don't have. You will feel the eclipse energy right now and building for the past week before and then lingering for the weeks after, because you have to realize it's not just a single day event. It's a whole season. We're in eclipse season for basically all of August and into the early days of September. But also remember that eclipses don't just affect us for that eclipse season. They affect us for weeks, months, years to come, even going into decades, because they're a part of a larger series of eclipses, which we're going to discuss more about in the second hour. So one of the number one themes of eclipses is they tend to bring radical and irrevocable change. So they don't just ease you into the changes they bring into your life. Instead, it feels like the rug has been pulled out from underneath you, and they tend to be turning points that you'll look back on years later and you'll say, wow, that's when a lot shifted in my life. So unlike a normal transit, especially an outer planet transit, for example, you might just work with it consciously a bit more. It can build over time. Eclipse energy is when a lot happens all at once, and it tends to feel very faded, like the decision was already made for this change to happen in your life in this moment of time a long time ago. maybe even pre-birth. So huge beginnings and endings can happen under eclipses, births of babies, people get engaged, people get married, people have a big career moment, major moves, major deaths and loss, huge theme. So these are the big events of life that seem to color eclipse season. And it feels like an eclipse season that time is compressed. So things that maybe seemed like they were far away are now suddenly happening on our doorstep. And plans we thought would happen maybe some point in the future are suddenly happening now. And, endings under eclipses will often feel very abrupt, like, oh my God, it all just happened all at once. And you're kind of left in the aftermath trying to process it and make meaning after the fact. And I know for myself, like, oh my gosh, so if you look at the last two eclipse seasons, the last one was in February, which is when basically I was in the funeral home dealing with the death of my father. So that one I'm still processing. And then if we look back to the eclipse season before that is September, and that's when the whole Charlie Kirk assassination happened. So you can really see how much things can get heated. So I gave you a personal example, my personal life, but then also collectively, like we're almost like still reeling, at least I am, I feel like we are from the last two eclipse seasons. So it shows you how much can happen in that moment and how long it takes to process after. Another big thing we see in eclipse season is the fall and rise of prominent figures. So they have a track record of coinciding with major public figures, either losing their power or reputation, some sort of downfall, resignation, scandals, even deaths of major figures definitely happens. And then also we do see sudden rises of people too. Maybe someone gets pushed into visibility or power overnight. As far as the death of major figures, eclipses have a big historical correlation with high-profile deaths. So, you will see around eclipse season in the news, like major figures dying. It's just a big common theme. So there's something about this eclipses and their timing that seem to mark collective endings and, personal endings as well. So, as I mentioned earlier, September 2025 eclipse season, we had that September 7th lunar eclipse, September 21st solar eclipse. That's when Charlie Kirk was assassinated a few days after that lunar eclipse. So this kind of sudden, violent, unexpected event set off this massive political and cultural fallout that many people are still trying to make sense of. And then we had that March 2026 eclipse season. So that was February 17th, solar eclipse, March 3rd, lunar eclipse. And actually, Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader of Iran, actually died in that eclipse season on February 28th from a U.S.-Israeli strike during the war. So that's a big dramatic fall of a prominent figure as it gets. He was a head of state tied to this active geopolitical conflict.
And didn't he also come to power during a powerful eclipse? Wasn't there something like that?
Did he?
I remember.
Oh, okay.
Remember we talked about this in the past podcast.
Oh, we did. Yeah. Fascinating. Yeah. That's very fascinating. So see, rise, fall of power within the eclipses. So actually, I haven't checked out his chart, but there's some people who have very eclipse sensitive charts. And what I've heard actually is that when they themselves were born very close to eclipse, which actually includes you, by the way, because you have the sun on your north node, right? So the moon just needs to get to your south node, and your moon is in Cancer and your moon is in Leo. So they're very close. So you're born very close to an eclipse. And so if you have if you have a lot of planets conjunct your nodes of the moon, or you're born very close to eclipse season, you might be very eclipse sensitive. So that's actually a good point with this guy. So, basically there's comings and goings that happen personally and collectively. People can be eclipsed out of our lives. Not only deaths, but just general relationships can end very abruptly, or they can be eclipsed in. Someone arrives very suddenly, someone very significantly to your life, that's going to be very significant to your life. It's almost too fast to process. So these comings and goings are very fated. They're very karmic. They're either linked to our karmic past and future, which is what the nodes are related to, which is why, it feels very much like the stuff that happens in eclipse is when there's almost like a condensed period of fated events that are meant to happen in your life, because that's what the nodes represent. So let's talk about solar versus lunar eclipses. So solar eclipses, which is going to be the August 12th eclipse, that's always happens on a new moon. They can often, not always though, relate to men, masculine figures in our lives, solar figures. So like our father, partners, if they're male, authority figures, if they're male, leaders, heads of states, kings. On a personal level, maybe something changes in your identity, your sense of visibility, your life direction. Whereas lunar eclipses always occur on a full moon, and they often relate to the woman or feminine figures in our lives, or the mother principle. So, people become mothers or something happens to their mother. They can relate to daughters, female friendships, the home, domestic sphere, the body. So these are not like hard and fast rules, just general concepts. And the most important thing with eclipses is that they're unpredictable. They tend to bring very random, out of nowhere events, things you couldn't have planned for or seen coming. There's a big pileup of change. Multiple things seem to happen simultaneously. It's like life suddenly is happening on fast forward. And this is where that Uranian energy really shows up, that eclipses have this kind of out of nowhere jolt quality that tends to accompany Uranus transits. And what's interesting is the second eclipse on August 27th is also in an exact square to Uranus. So that one's especially crazy. They're both crazy for different reasons, but that one actually is even square Uranus. So that even makes it more unpredictable. They tend to also reveal things. So they tend to have a way of stripping away things that were maybe hidden, bringing things to light that we've been avoiding. So there can be maybe a message we get or a piece of information or a realization we have that arrives just suddenly rather than seeking it out. They're often, eclipses are really related to times when material that was once in the unconscious or shadow can break through. And I also want to touch on eclipses close to your birthday. So if your if your birthday falls on or within about 5 days of an eclipse, like before or after, that birthday year will tend to be especially intense and dramatic because your solar return is essentially activated by the eclipse energy for that entire year. And I actually looked up my own chart on October 7th. Oh my gosh. So October 17th, 2005, there was a partial lunar eclipse exactly on my birthday. And the year following was actually, unfortunately, one of the most traumatic and yet intense and life-changing years of my life that probably, if that didn't happen, I maybe wouldn't have been doing the work that I am doing now. So that's when things really spiraled out of control. I moved from Vancouver to LA. I got involved with a woman who was very pathological. A lot of powerful people were involved. There's a lot of trauma that I experienced in LA in the music industry. And then it was just a downward spiral after that. And interestingly, that was my eclipse season year. So that was, I can definitely speak to that being true. So just as a side note, if your birthday is close to this eclipse, might be an eventful year for you. And then some technicalities of eclipses. So not everyone is going to be affected by eclipses in the same way. You always want to check if you have planets or angles being aspected by the eclipse. And in general, the signs being affected most will be the ones that are in the same mode as the eclipse. So for the eclipse on August 12th, this is in a fixed sign, Leo. So Leo's, Aquarius, Scorpio, Taurus placements are affected the most.
All the fixed signs, basically.
All the fixed signs, because they're going to conjunct, oppose, or square, right? So that's going to usually bring the most dramatic events. And for the eclipses on the 27th, on the eclipse on the 27th, that's going to happen in Pisces. So then Pisces, Virgo, Sagittarius, Gemini are affected the most. But it's not always the case that you need to have your chart being aspected. So sometimes your personal planets are not even being hit, but you will experience huge developments, huge changes in those areas of life anyway. Like there's so many things involved, by the way, that we don't even look into, like midpoints and there's all sorts of ways that we can be affected by eclipse and not even realize it. But you always want to check where houses the eclipse falls in your chart. So this one will fall on the Leo Aquarius axis on the 12th and the Virgo Pisces axis on the 27th. So we're going to go into what it might mean for each rising sign in the second part. So eclipses always come in pairs: new moon, full moon, solar, lunar eclipse, and they always arrive in a family in signs that will continue for about 18 to 24 months. And they bring us a series of developments in the areas of life that they affect. And eclipses will often repeat in the same sign, and sometimes even the exact degree every 19 years. So this next family of eclipses will happen in the Leo Aquarius axis because the nodes have switched, right? So this is a series that began in February 17th with the last solar eclipse. And the reason why it began back then is because you don't need to have the sun and the moon exactly conjunct the nodes. I think they need to be within like 13 degrees. So you can have an eclipse that's in that axis and yet not have the nodes switched, basically. And this is going to also overlap with the Virgo Pisces axis series of eclipses, which actually began in September 18th, 2024. So we're closing one eclipse season, this Virgo Pisces axis, and we're opening the Leo Aquarius axis basically at the same time.
So for people maybe who are not that astrology savvy and may fall into cosmic paranoia, an eclipse doesn't mean necessarily a negative, bad event. It's beyond what the little ego personality determines, judges as good or bad. It's something what needs to happen on an evolutionary process level. Is that correct?
And like, it's just, even this concept, like if you zoom out of like good or bad, like even I shared this post recently about talking about the death of my father. And I said, when someone dies, you go through two deaths. You go through the death of your father and you go through a personal death, the death of the person that you were actually. And, I got a few comments from people who were saying, what were they saying? They were saying, you're making this person's death about you. They died. They're the one who suffered this terrible thing. And it's like, and then I realized, because I didn't even translate their message, I was like, why are they thinking and they're making it about me? And then I realized they see death as a bad thing. So you know what I'm saying? Yeah. So even in the larger picture, death is not actually a bad thing. Like death is just the changing of, you're losing your physical body, right? So to me, like it's about our relationship with change, and death is why we see eclipses as bad things. Because people tend to fear
endings.
Yeah, people tend to fear death and change. But, like that's the whole issue with our world, is that I think that we have a very
materialistic.
We have a distorted relationship with death. Like death is death always a bad thing? No, because like even with my dad's case, yes, it was hard for the people around him for sure. My dad was suffering. He didn't want to be here anymore. Death wasn't a bad thing, right? So I think the reason that people tend to fear eclipses, like yes, traditional cultures definitely recommended not to go out to them, that there can be a thinning of the veils, a weakening of the energy, right? But the change that eclipses bring are in relation, like how we handle eclipses is how we relate to change and death itself. And I think since we're a very death phobic and even change phobic culture, we tend to fear eclipses. That's how I see it, right? Yeah.
And then also we're in the age of, the materialistic worldview age. So we definitely fear death on an unconscious level.
No, death and grief is like a very taboo subject. So I feel like eclipses bring in these to forefront and it freaks people out. So let's keep going forward. Where was I? So eclipse season starts about a week before the first eclipse. So we're already in it now. We're recording this on a Saturday, August 8th, and it will end 7 days after the second eclipse. And the most intense range is that weeks between the eclipses. So basically all of August, we're like eclipse season, basically. So let's talk about the first eclipse. So this is, again, this Leo Aquarius series of eclipses going from 2026 to 2028. We got our first one on February 17th at 28 degrees, 2026. And then our second one will be August 12th at 20 degrees. So August 12th, solar eclipse at 20 degrees of Leo is what we're working with. So It's at the same time, it's a new beginning, because this is actually the first in the series of eclipses that's in Leo. The first one that happened in February was actually in Aquarius. So this is the first in a series of eclipses in the sign of Leo. There's something new that will probably get seeded right now. And the Leo eclipse will be a continuation of themes that began in the last solar eclipse in February. And the visibility, so eclipses tend to be stronger in the areas of the Earth that they're the most visible, with total eclipses having the most powerful effect. So we're going to have a totality of a total eclipse in Greenland, Iceland, northern Spain, tiny part of Portugal, parts of the Arctic Ocean, northern Russia, most of Europe, most of Canada, the northern United States, including Alaska, and to the northeast, northwestern Africa. So the places to watch, because I know that Trump has stuff going on with Greenland, right? Interesting, northern Spain. So these are the places that could experience, as far as like geographically, the biggest changes, because the eclipse is passing right over, right? And there's two different types of solar eclipses. There's a north node solar eclipse and a south node solar eclipse. So this is actually going to be a south node solar eclipse. So this points that there's going to be energy being released. We're going to be getting rid of something, letting go of something. There can also be returns from the past, maybe a sense of accepting something that we need to let go of, looking inward. On the negative side, there can be a sense of loss, weakening, misfortune, events that we perceive as negative. And then it's a fire eclipse, so there will be drama. Leo eclipses also relate to solar figures like leaders, kings, rulers. There can be issues relating to fire, wars. There can be upsurges of creative energy. And since it's in a fixed sign like Leo, it will bring a very enduring outcome that will last for years to come. So this eclipse is also going to be activated by a Leo stellium. We not only have the sun and the moon in Leo, which is always what's happened when you have a new moon in Leo, but we have Mercury and Jupiter all bunched together, which intensifies the themes of Leo. So this is something about our self-expression, something about leadership, something about confidence, the way that we're visible to the world, that's could be coming forward. And there might be, I feel like with this eclipse in particular, there's some sense of like old identity that we've been wearing, some old persona, some old way of expressing ourselves, some old way of relating to our creativity, which will need to be let go of. So if you're in the middle of a moment in your life and you're like, I feel like the person I was and the person I'm showing up in the world as just doesn't fit anymore. I've just lost that spark. That's kind of what this Leo energy feels like, is like, I just don't want to play this role anymore. It doesn't mean it wasn't meaningful to you at the point in time it was, but there's some sense of getting tired of an old identity that you've been playing for some time now that's kind of being released with this eclipse. And then other energies affecting the eclipse, we have Mercury opposite Pluto in Aquarius. So there's going to be maybe some sort of communication issues, communication breakdowns, maybe issues related to travel. There can be issues related to power dynamics. Maybe there's, you might start examining your fear of being misunderstood, or maybe something you say gets taken the wrong way, or maybe something said to you that's very revealing during this eclipse. Maybe, conversations will carry an extra charge, or some sort of material comes to light around this eclipse season that wasn't able to be seen before. So, Mercury, Pluto can really bring up charged conversations psychologically, emotionally. Something can rise up out of the shadows. That can be either an internal process or external, like someone says something to you and you're just like, wow, that just really changed the way that I see things. And then Mercury will also be sextile Uranus. So you could have a sudden insight, maybe a breakthrough of some sort, or maybe some unexpected news or information makes you reevaluate things. And what's nice is actually this eclipse, which tends to be destabilizing, is actually being stabilized by a trine to Saturn. So Saturn is retrograde in Aries, and it's going to offer a little bit of a more stabilizing, grounding energy. And it's also going to bring a sense of permanence to whatever changes happens. during this eclipse season. We had Mars just move into Cancer. So we're moving into a very moody, emotionally protective eclipse season. We might feel very sensitive. We might feel like we get our feelings hurt a little bit easier. We might feel like we need to kind of retreat into a cocoon and be a little bit more protective of ourselves this eclipse season. And then interestingly, we also have ongoing Venus, which is centered Libra, which is going to be opposite Neptune in Aries. So there might be something about a relationship that changes during this eclipse season. Maybe you get disillusioned in a relationship, or, maybe you're significantly idealizing someone in a relationship. On a positive side, this can be moments of creative inspiration, but looking out for kind of like maybe this cross of idealizing, or maybe someone you idealize, you feel disillusioned with. So there's something going on with relationships that's a bit foggy right now. And then the bigger pattern is actually we have a grand sextile forming around this eclipse. So we have Venus in Libra, Mercury and Jupiter in Leo, Uranus in Gemini, Neptune in Aries, Pluto in Aquarius, all around 3 to 6 degrees. And this is also the exact same degree that the Barbeau basket from mid-July occurred. So we have this grand sextile, which is a harmonious flowing pattern, but paired with this eclipse suggests that this disruptive eclipse energy has a lot of support structured around it and flow to it than the usual chaos. So it's very interesting because basically like the inner planets have basically kind of like joined this conversation of this basket. So maybe something that was set in motion, or maybe that's something that was seeded during the basket formation in mid-July will really get pushed forward and like, okay, now we're doing this. So some practical guidance, you want to look at, it's a south node eclipse. So we want to lean into the idea of like letting go of something. There's some old identity, maybe some old way of expressing yourself. Maybe you have some old way of being seen, or some old way you feel like you're performing or showing up in the world. How has this eclipse revealed that it's actually starting to hold you back? And do you need to maybe step back from that role that you've been playing, or maybe it's an old story about yourself you need to let go of, so that you can get a better picture of some new identity that's going to start emerging? Because again, we have this ending of this one and the beginning kind of merged together. And then work with Leo themes directly. Like, what would you express in your life if you created from joy rather than trying to gain approval? Where are you still maybe needing validation or applause in order to express yourself? How far back does that wound go? And what would you need to say to that part of you to reparent it so it feels safe for self-expression? Because, if you look into the astrology of the next year, we're going to have Jupiter and Leo join the South Node, right? This is a very creative time for sure, but there's also a letting go of something. So we're going to be letting go of old ways of showing up in the world. Maybe either we dim our light to stay safe, or we show up in like a very performative way that's not in alignment with who we are. There's some way that we creatively express ourselves that needs to change during this eclipse. And then with Mercury opposite Pluto, just pay attention to, maybe a secret or a shadow being revealed, or maybe difficult conversations. Maybe you're going to get pushed to express yourself in a way that you have never expressed yourself before. And then take note of any new ideas coming in with Mercury to Uranus. Maybe work with them or journal with them or sit with them rather than take immediate action. And then lean into this trine to Saturn. So keep a routine, keep structures that support you through change. Think about the long-term impacts of things before you say something, especially because eclipse season can get very heated. And then with Mars in Cancer, this is a good time for just not overextending yourself emotionally, go into a bit of a cocoon, protect your energy, and, anchor into that Venus opposite Neptune, and maybe spend some time creatively making something. Be wary of romance or love affairs that happen or occur under this eclipse season, and notice where you're looking at things through rose-colored glasses, or seeing people for their potential and not for who they actually are. And then remember, something was activated probably mid-July, which has just opened up for the next visible step. So just go with those changes rather than resist them. If you've been getting value from these conversations and want to go deeper, we'd love to invite you to join our membership, where for just $11 a month with additional savings if you choose a 6-month or yearly membership, you'll unlock over 176 hours of exclusive members-only content that goes far beyond what we can cover in the public podcast. This is how you can access the second hour of every podcast we have ever recorded, which is categorized by topics like awakening and spirituality, shadow work and psychology, spiritual warfare and occult forces, esoteric astrology and cosmic cycles, and relationships and love, and where in general we discuss the deeper spiritual dynamics behind world events. The second hour also allows us to discuss topics that have been previously censored on social media and other platforms, and to have completely open discussions we can't always have in the first hour. Along the way, we share practical tools and insights to help you cultivate discernment, deepen your inner work, and navigate this time of transition with greater awareness. As a member, you'll also gain access to our private Piercing the Veil of Reality community forum, where seekers from around the world can come together to discuss these topics, share their experiences, ask questions, and support one another. Your membership is one of the most practical ways to support our work. It allows us to remain independent, keep these podcasts completely ad-free, so we can continue creating uncensored content that we hope serves people all over the world. If that resonates with you, we'd love to have you join us. Visit veilofreality.com/membership to join. We look forward to welcoming you into the community. All right, so now we're talking about the August 27th or 28th, depending on if you live in Europe or Australia, at 4 degrees, 54 minutes of Pisces, lunar eclipse. So this eclipse happened at the same degree 19 years ago during the August 28th, 2007 eclipse. So if you can, you might want to reflect if there was any major change that happened for you back in certain parts of your life in 2007 and also 2008, because 2008 is connected with the Saros cycle of these eclipses. So these family of eclipses actually reoccurred in 2007 and 2008 in different ways. So just to reflect, if something is happening in an area of your life where you're experiencing maybe a similar change now, not the same, but like something similar is happening now. And so this one is a North Node lunar eclipse. So these are going to be more positive potentially than a South Node eclipse. They can be more expansive. There can be new energy entering, a new opportunity, maybe a new relationship, a sense of something pulling you toward the future. So they can feel sometimes lucky, but also excessive. They can bring too much of something, too much emotion, too much escapism, too much overindulgence, too much of anything to do with Pisces things. So drugs, fantasy, escapism, spiritual bypassing, overwhelm. And so this is an almost total lunar eclipse. So it's almost 96% of the moon will be in the Earth's shadow. And so it's a water eclipse. So we're looking at water eclipse themes. Pisces tends to relate to themes relating to surrender, escapism, fantasy, dreams, spiritual awakenings, emotional overwhelm, addictions, maybe art or creative inspiration, the collective unconscious, karma, mysticism, victimhood, intuition. They can affect bodies of water in general. So we can have literal like water events like flooding or issues with water, not only just literal water, but the water of the unconscious. So an upsurge of something from the collective unconscious, an upsurge in energy from our dreams, an upsurge in something that brings out a collective feeling from us, which is actually, again, remember the Charlie Kirk assassination happened with this Pisces eclipse.
So this North Node lunar eclipse is the full moon eclipse, correct?
Yes.
So that's also interesting if you talk about the full moon, and I've written an article about this in context of the hyperdimensional matrix, hostile forces, spiritual beings. It's known throughout the more occult traditions. Then every full moon, the veil thins.
Yes.
And negative entities have more influence on people in general. And that's exemplified with the werewolf mythology, for example. And people kind of becoming very agitated, or something happens on a full moon. It's known through all various traditions and mythologies. But there's something real about it in the context of their other forces, other beings have more access to the human being.
Yeah.
Right? That's why it's definitely, we have this whole distortion of spirituality and the whole distortion of the moon itself and Wicca and moon worship and full moon rituals, which from the more the old esoteric tradition, there were ceremonies done in context of protecting from the full moon energies and not opening yourself up to them, let alone worshiping them. So I definitely advise against any full moon rituals because that can potentially create all kinds of traps of agreements. And again, it also depends obviously individually on the chart, for example, or where there are any possible entry points.
Yeah, I mean, also arguably, I feel like our attitudes towards the full moon have to do with our own attitudes towards the feminine in general. And as we were sharing earlier, like we're scared of the cycles of life and death and change, which the moon represents as well. I think that there's a almost primal fear of the feminine and the moon, you know? So I think that's just one perspective. I'm not encouraging people to do a ritual around the eclipse, but we also want to look at like the moon is directly related to the feminine principle on Earth, which I think we always kind of viewed as like a bit chaotic and unknown and unpredictable, right?
And that's in that context, you don't want to get absolutely not into fear-mongering or anything like that, and understanding that this has also a teaching function. So whatever comes up, or even these forces, whatever you may want to call them, spirits, archonic forces, or whatever are affecting us from non-physical realms, have a teaching function to expose what you need to work on or integrate.
Yeah, and the thing is like, so like we already had this Pisces eclipse when we had the Charlie Kirk assassination. So like you can get a flavor. That was almost like a full moon Pisces eclipse on steroids. So like so many Pisces themes, like you know, there was first like the collective trauma of like so many people witnessing this guy get killed, right? Which is like, to me, this is totally unnatural for us to have all watched in HD a guy get brutally murdered, right? But then we had this whole Christian martyr theme, which was very Virgo Pisces. It was like, this is like the most Pisces eclipse I've seen in my lifetime, right? Like where we had this whole, you know, they said he got martyred, and then you had Erica Kirk do this whole I forgive him thing, right? On her is his
all the conspiracies popping out.
Yeah, and that's the whole thing. That's why I'm like, honestly, I'm a little traumatized from the last eclipse seasons because like you can see the collective is still processing what happened last September.
Still trying to figure
and
it out.
Still trying to unpack all of that, which I understand. This is like a huge assassination. Like, you know, like the last time we had an assassination this big, arguably, is like, you know, RFK Senior or JFK, right? So this is a big political moment, but you can see that these eclipses bring up like I would, you know, besides the theories, and which I'm not going to get into about what happened, that's not the time and place for this, but you can see the upsurge of emotion, the upsurge of material from the collective unconscious, like people who didn't even agree with him. But at the same time, you did see this upsurge of material from the collective unconscious, the shadow material, people hating him and saying good, right? So Pisces,
it increased polarization too between.
I know, and then and look again. Remember what I said at the beginning is like the stuff that happens during the eclipse like unfolds for months, years to come, right? Look at how much that death shifted everything in what's going on in America politically, deep in this divide, at least on the conservative side, and you know, all sorts of stuff. It was almost like,
in a sense, the beginning of the end of the MAGA movement on the political side, right?
Yeah. So, you know, there is a lot that will happen, a lot of collective feeling. I also want to point out one last thing. Pisces also relates to immigration, refugees, and people being displaced. So themes of like borders and like people who are in between places. So, you know, we had this major, maybe you can just touch on this like whole crazy immigration thing. Just briefly explain what happened for people who don't know from this.
Oh, about a week ago, what happened in Morocco and Spain, bordering Spain, this city got invaded by Moroccan immigrants. Over a few days, a Spanish city, population of 50 or 60,000 got invaded, literally, I mean, overwhelmed by 50, 60,000 immigrants.
Yeah.
Over like a few days. So there was definitely coordinated, planned, right? This whole mass immigration. It's really fascinating just to flood Europe with more immigrants. So there's a lot of conspiracy around it, a lot of weird things going on, even with Trump, who he was not satisfied with Spain because they didn't let him use the Air Force bases for his war in Iran and kind of threatened him before. Now all of a sudden they get flooded with immigrants.
Yeah,
it's all kinds. I mean, it's all geopolitical stuff on the surface level, but that could also be related to big evolutionary forces, as shown through the eclipses as well.
Yeah. So this eclipse is actually going to be visible on a much wider part of the globe than the August 12th one. So visible from North America, South America, parts of Europe, parts of Africa. So again, these are the countries that get affected the most. So you might see something happen or develop in regards to immigration, or maybe something like closes again, because this is the last in the series, so that's also a theme. So, remember, this is a closing chapter of the Virgo Pisces eclipse series. This eclipse series began nearly 2 years earlier in September 2024, and we're now in the final stretch. And only one more eclipse remains after this one, which is going to be a lunar eclipse in Virgo in February 2027, before the series fully closes, and it's just going to be in the next axis, Leo Aquarius axis. So think of this as less of something new starting with this eclipse on the 27th and more like the second to last word in this 2-year conversation the sky has been having about Virgo Pisces themes. So service versus surrender, health versus escapism, discernment versus faith. And the through line with the eclipses picking back up is something from 6 months ago, March 3rd, lunar eclipse at 12 degrees Virgo. So some sort of theme surfaced then, which is now getting its emotional and spiritual counterpart in Pisces. And then we have 11 to 12 months ago, September 2025. So maybe something also happens with the whole Charlie Kirk thing too, by the way. Mm-hmm. Oh, I think they're going to decide... so like they had the pre-trial, right? And then they're going to decide if it like goes to trial, which it obviously will in September. So now you have something picking up again from, that September 2025 eclipse as well. So in general, whatever material stirred up in that lunar eclipse is going to resurface now a year later asking to be resolved. So that's actually perfect. You're going to probably see something happen there, and then just think about in your own life too, right? And then you can go even further, March 14th, 2025, that lunar eclipse in Virgo. That was an early data point in this series that you can look and glance back at. And then we have the 24 months ago, September 18th, 2024. That was the opening eclipse in this series. So that was the original seed. So whatever emotional, spiritual, or boundary dissolving theme that was activated back then is now going to reach its near final resolution point. So if the September 2024 eclipse asks, what do I need to release, feel? What do I need to believe in? How do I need to surrender more? The eclipse since then has been refining that question through both this kind of practical Virgo lens and the emotional Pisces lens. So the eclipse is close to this final answer, not the finish line, that's February next year, 2027, but the eclipse will be where the pattern becomes unmistakably clear. And I know that, especially with the North Node in Pisces, like it's been a huge lesson in surrender for so many people. Like the Virgo side of this axis is more like you can do all the work in the world, all the inner work, all the health work, all the service, right? But then ultimately you have to realize there are just many things in life which are completely beyond your control. And sometimes we like obsess and try and perfect things and strive after something when really we just have to really let it go in order for it to come into our lives. So I think that's just been a general theme of just overall realizing there's only so much we can do to make things happen. We ultimately have to surrender and realize that there's something else larger in control besides our own personal will. So we have this North Node pulling us forward, but through this last remaining thread of the old Virgo Pisces story. And again, this total lunar eclipse is tightly square Uranus and Gemini, and squares are friction. They force us to take action. And with Uranus involved, that action tends to be very sudden, unexpected. It's very hard to plan around. So since this is also an eclipse, which is very disruptive in itself, this Uranus square will really exaggerate it. So expect the release or revelation that comes with this eclipse to arrive rather abruptly rather than gradually. It's like all of a sudden your life has just changed and there you are. So don't expect themes to unfold gently around this later eclipse in the 27th. You might get sudden news, a sudden shift in circumstances in the areas of life that Pisces, Virgo rule in your chart. And it's going to be opposite Mercury in Virgo, which is conjunct the sun. So the Mercury and the sun are almost exactly conjunct just a day or so before the eclipse. And, this means that some sort of idea or thought or some sort of news or communication will carry unusual weight during this eclipse season. And because the moon opposes the sun-Mercury conjunction, whatever emotional material the eclipse stirs up is directly linked to some sort of communication or news or something being said or something being spoken or something becomes very mentally clear that's been unfolding over this eclipse season. So there might be a conversation or a decision or something very explicitly being outlined in words here that affect your plan. So we want to pay attention to that. And then just going back to the Charlie Kirk thing, like there's obviously going to be some sort of like communication data point that's going to kind of push that whole thing forward. And this also reinforces the whole Virgo Pisces axis theme you've already been building. So some event, you'll get a sense of clarity, which is very Virgo Mercury, or a sense of like, this feeling of like profound surrender, Pisces moon, while also feeling very mentally clear on something that needs to change. So that one is really interesting to me. I'm also I'm a person who's very sensitive to the Virgo Pisces axis, which I'll talk about in the second hour. I'll give some personal examples. So, a couple additional aspects that we can just add to round out the picture. We also have Jupiter trine Saturn with Jupiter in Leo, Saturn retrograde in Aries. So we do have a little bit of stabilizing, harmonious support running alongside the chaoticness of this eclipse. So Uranus destabilizes while this trine supports building something sustainable out of whatever the eclipse reveals. And then we also have Mars square Saturn, which traditionally is a tense aspect. There's going to be some friction between our impulse to do something. You might feel ready to act on what the eclipse surface only to realize that you're running into a limit that won't budge. So you might feel like, oh, I got to take action on whatever was revealed. And then you'll be like, oh, but I need to wait. There's only so much I can do right now. I just need to be patient. All right, so before we close out part one, let's just zoom out for a moment. We've covered a lot. So the biggest thing I want you to remember is that eclipses are periods of accelerated change where a lot can happen all at once. And I also want to note, people tend to fear eclipses because of this. But this does not always mean the change is going to be bad. Change can be exactly the change you needed or you've been waiting for. And it's just here, right? So these months are going to be this period that something ends, something begins. Your life can suddenly move much faster than you expected. People in your lives, aspect of your lives can be eclipsed out. People and aspects of your lives can be eclipsed in. Maybe something hidden comes to light or something that's been sitting in the unconscious suddenly becomes impossible to ignore. Plans can change. One door opens. Maybe another may open that you didn't even know was available or there. And sometimes we don't understand what an eclipse is doing to us until months, even years later. That's why I was like, we're still processing the eclipse from September. And for me, February was a really huge life-changing one. So, we want to just be aware that this is going to be something that's going to shift the trajectory of our lives if it does affect us. And I don't think the best way to approach an eclipse is by trying to predict exactly what's going to happen. It's much more useful to become incredibly observant. So this is not a good time to just death scroll, distract yourself on social media. Pay attention to like omens, pay attention to signs, pay attention to synchronicities, pay attention to your dreams. pay attention to your life, pay attention to your inner world, right? We always want someone outside of us to tell us like what's going to happen, or like as if it's going to show up on the Twitter timeline. Like you might see on the Twitter timeline how the eclipse is affecting the world, right? But as far as your own personal life, we need to look within. We need to pay attention to our life, and you need to ask yourself, what is life showing me right now that needs to change? Because August contains two very different eclipse stories here. We have August 12th, this South Node solar eclipse in Leo. This is about release, a release of an old identity, an old way of maybe seeking validation, an old role, maybe an old way you learned to dim yourself, maybe a way that you feel like you're still needing attention or approval in order to feel safe expressing who you actually are. And because this is the beginning of this Leo Aquarius eclipse story, what is being released now may be actually making room for a larger chapter that's meant to fold over the next couple of years. So then on August 27th, 28th, we have this North Node lunar eclipse in Pisces, and this one has a very different feeling. So something is coming in, something is pulling us forward, but it's doing that while simultaneously bringing us towards the end of a Virgo Pisces story that's been unfolding since September. So August really sits at this threshold. So one eclipse cycle is beginning, another is ending. An old story and a new story are basically overlapping. So that means some of us may experience this month a mixture of beginnings and endings almost happening simultaneously on top of each other. So you may not even know what the new chapter is yet. You might just simply know that there's some old story, some old way of living that you need to let go of. So as we move through this eclipse season, here's some questions you can reflect on. What has been changing in my life since September 2024? Is there a repeating emotional theme, relational theme, spiritual theme, health, work theme that's followed me through this entire Virgo Pisces eclipse cycle? What now feels like it's coming very close to completion? What am I being asked to surrender rather than trying to control? And then look towards a new story. Is there an identity, a role, a way of expressing yourself that you're beginning to outgrow? Where do you feel like you're still performing rather than expressing your essence? Where have you been dimming your light? Where are you ready to stop doing things for validation and doing things for the sheer joy of doing it? And perhaps most importantly, what could the endings in your life be trying to make room for? So you may not necessarily know the answer yet, but just pay attention to this month, to things that are unexpected, to things that are ending, to changes of direction, and especially pay attention to anything that feels like life is suddenly telling you you're going to be doing this now, because that acceleration is one of the signatures of eclipse season. So that brings us to the end of part one. And now in part two, we're going to take this much further. We're going to talk about how to actually navigate the eclipses season, the do's and don'ts that we usually do. You can just take that and take what you need from that. We're going to talk about how various cultures tend to treat eclipses, some practices they do. We're going to also talk about the eclipse cycles, the Saros cycle. What does that mean? How do eclipses echo each other from decades earlier? I'm going to share a personal example as a case study for this. And then we're going to talk about some other case studies of people whose charts are being strongly activated by this eclipse, including Stephen Forrest and Vladimir Putin. So Vladimir Putin gets most affected by that August 12th eclipse, and the eclipse is also visible over Russia. And then we're going to talk about Stephen Forrest and the whole drama going on in the astrology community right now. If you don't know, Stephen Forrest is being canceled in spite of really being one of them.
It's the irony.
So it's kind of funny for like people, those of us who have been canceled like multiple times since 2020. And he's really being canceled, by the way.
The woke mob.
Because I want to add, like, a lot of people say, I've been canceled because someone like deleted them off Facebook or disagreed with them. That's not being canceled. Being canceled is having a large mob of people trying to destroy your reputation and remove you from professional organizations, which is exactly what's happening to him. So we're going to talk about him. He's getting hit by the August 27th eclipse. And then I'm going to do something special, which we don't do very often. We're going to go through all all 12 rising signs, and we're going to show you where the August eclipses fall in your chart and go through what you may be letting go of and what would be coming into your life for each rising sign. And if you don't know what rising sign you are, you can easily access a free astrology chart on various different apps. You can use Time Passages, you can use astro.com, and you can get that information yourself. There's a million websites. So if you want to understand what this eclipse season can mean specifically for you, make sure you join us for part 2.
And if you're not a member yet and would like to access to all part 2s and support our work, go to veilofreality.com/membership and sign up there. See you on part 2.